Okay, we've been talking about culture. I wanted to do another video about culture and talk about specifically how I've been thinking about culture in terms of resolution. And another way to think about that might be in terms of zoom level. But I think it's a useful model, and as I kind of explain it, it might be self-evident how it could be useful when thinking about culture. Especially when looking at exceptions to cultural norms and how those might come about, and other exceptions as well. So thinking about resolution, maybe the best way to describe it would be, well, first of all, to say that culture could be from the resolution of the entire human race. That would be probably the largest useful, probably not even useful, but the most extreme, plausible resolution for us to think about culture right now, and then could zoom all the way in to the level of the individual. And there are multiple plausible stopping points in between the whole human race and the individual. So the best way that I can think of to conceptualize that is uh, imagine you're looking at Google Maps, right? We talked about Google Maps in a previous video. So imagine you're looking at a maps application like Google Maps, and you zoom out to the point that you're looking at the entire Earth, like a globe floating in space. And you can drag the mouse and spin the Earth, right? Okay, so that might be your maximum zoom out that is at all practical or plausible. And imagine a dotted line around the entire Earth. Now that could be considered a cultural boundary, right? A cultural border. Although it's not a very useful border because it's not like we know of anybody that lives outside of the Earth. But if you imagine that at some point we made first contact with some alien species, and then that alien species would have some other culture, we would probably say that no matter how similar or different the alien species culture is from ours, let's call them Klingons or whatever, no matter how different or similar the Klingons are to us, it would probably be true to say that all of humans, Earthlings, have more in common with one another than we would have in common with the alien species. So that would be a cultural boundary. All humans have certain shared cultural values, certain shared traditions, certain shared rituals or similarities of rituals. So that could be considered a cultural boundary. Although it's not very useful. It's not very useful to say we as humans have a culture, right? And when we think about culture, we usually think of cultural differences between humans and other humans, right? So let's zoom in a little bit. If we zoom in so that the Earth basically fills the screen in your imagination, it fills your field of view. And now we could start to draw some dotted lines as cultural boundaries that kind of divide up the Earth, more or less. And probably a very easy cultural boundary to identify might be the boundary between Western culture and Eastern culture. Now, that's not a perfect boundary because there are plenty of other cultures that might not be easily identified with either Western or Eastern. And of course, there are subdivisions on both sides, but we're looking at this resolution because it might be useful to think in terms of the similarities that all countries or all regions of the world that are affected by the historical context of Western culture and those that are more influenced or grow out of the historical and cultural context of Eastern culture. And so you have kind of a religious divide, you have a rich history of culture and art and architecture and science and philosophy. And so that would be a pretty interesting or pretty useful cultural divide. You can imagine that dotted line. And then let's zoom in on the Western side because that's the side that I would probably obviously uh, relate to. So let's go to Western culture. Western culture would be made up of all of Europe, and then you have uh, the uh, the UK, and then you have countries that have grown out of the British Empire, which you would include the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So, what new boundaries might you draw on your map, so to speak? If you zoomed in, so you only included it. Now it doesn't work so well if you try to imagine on the map, because Australia is over here and it may not work so well. But if you tried to imagine zooming in to just so that just Western culture or the West fills your field of view, what new dotted lines might you draw? Well, you might separate most of Europe from the UK and countries and regions that have grown naturally from the British Empire. So you could probably isolate out as a unique cultural subset the UK, Canada, United States, Australia, and New Zealand. That might make sense. I think that Canadians, for example, and Americans and Brits have more in common with one another than they do with Germans or Italians or Greeks, even though all of those grow out of or belong to Western culture. So there might be, from a certain perspective at least, there might be an interesting divide there. You might be able to zoom in so that you only see North America. And you might be able to, at a certain resolution, if you pick the perfect resolution, I think it's probably safe to say Americans and Canadians, because of our shared geography, our long-standing geographic closeness, we have certain things in common with one another because of sort of cultural bleed-through or whatever through history than we do with any others that would belong to that sort of Anglo-American branch of the Western tree, so to speak. And so you could probably draw a dotted line around the United States and Canada. And then if you zoom in slightly more, well, Canada would fall away. And I'm imagining all of this from my own perspective as a Texan, right? So that's sort of where our destination is. But whatever part of the world you come from, you might be able to kind of do the same thought experiment. Zoom in at slight increments and see what parts of the world, what entire groups of people would fall away because they're less similar, and what would still stay at that resolution, so you could sort of draw an imaginary dotted line around those particular regions or groups of people. So we get to the United States, we might be able to divide between North and South. I mean, that's a cultural boundary that historically has been so important that wars have been fought along that boundary, the American Civil War. And so you could divide North and South. So I would continue to zoom into the South. Maybe I would eventually zoom into just Texas. Texans have perhaps a particular culture. We talked in a previous video about West Texas versus East Texas. There is certainly a cultural difference there. And so maybe you even get down to the cultural level of my local community. So I live in a town called San Angelo, Texas. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the differences between my town and neighboring towns, but I'm sure there are certain cultural differences that could be identified. Even you get down to a community level, you might be able to find communal differences between groups of neighborhoods, especially if those groups of neighborhoods have separate school systems, which is true in my town. So if you grew up in a certain neighborhood and you've lived your whole life in that neighborhood and you went to that high school compared to the other high school, you're going to have certain cultural differences. And that's certainly true. There's a region in my city called Lakeview, and there's a Lakeview High School, and that region is a little different than the rest of the city of San Angelo in certain ways. And so that might be an interesting line to divide. Eventually, you're going to get down to the family level, right? You get down to the family level, and you might say that even you can zoom to the point where you see, a city block, and you can paint little dotted lines around each individual house. So each household may have unique cultural aspects that differ from their neighbors who live next door. Now, at that resolution, it makes sense, But if you zoom out to the whole country, that line just doesn't make sense anymore. We have more in common with our neighbors than we do with people who live in New York City, for example. But if you zoom in, there is certainly a difference between us and our neighbors. And of course, then you could even look at sub-family groups within a household, and eventually you get to the individual. Each individual is going to have a unique way of doing things, a unique way of speaking, a unique way of acting that might be different, might be influenced by other cultures, you can say, that are different from the cultural influences of others in the same family. And that's pretty much the most you can zoom in, right? If you want to get into subpersonalities, you'd be in the realm of psychology, and that would be fascinating to relate that, perhaps. But that's probably outside of my ability to ascertain. So why is this model useful? Well, it's useful because we talked in a previous video about the need for fuzziness when we describe cultures. We used an expression from Seth Godin that I'm a big fan of. People like us do things like this. And he chose to word his definition of culture, although I don't think he necessarily calls that just a definition of culture. He uses that expression for other things, but I call it a definition, a possible definition of culture. And the way he chose to word those expressions is very interesting because it leaves a lot of wiggle room. People like us. Well, who exactly is people like us? It's a little open-ended. It allows you to sometimes include people outside your family, sometimes exclude members of your own family or community or country. It allows a little bit of fuzziness. And that's why in my model, I asked you to imagine drawing dotted lines as cultural boundaries, because they are certainly not hard, bold lines. There are lines that allow a lot of influence to go both ways. There's a lot of fuzziness. People might live outside of the geographical location of their culture, and they might belong to a different culture. And that can even happen within the family, at the family level. If you have a multicultural family because children of the family have married individuals from around the world, that's what's happened in my family, for example. So that obviously causes the cultural boundaries to become fuzzy, to become movable, right? And unstable, but not in a bad way, unstable, just something that is variable. And that's good. That's a good thing, because cultures need to grow and they need to accept and give influence to nearby cultures. This is how cultures continue to exist, right? Because if they stop being useful, then they disappear, or they get swallowed up by other cultures. And so these cultures that are variable, you can almost see them like living things, I kind of think of. But that's the idea of resolution. So I'm going to leave you with that. And I've still been thinking about that. I welcome comments or critiques in the comments. But it's a good thing to think about how cultures exist at different resolutions. And at every resolution you can imagine, you are always going to have a dotted line. In other words, there's always going to be room for that fuzziness, that wiggle room. That's all I have for you today. So talk to you tomorrow.